こんにちは。イギリスのセインズベリー日本芸術研究所のサイモン・ケイナーと申します。はじめまして、今日よろしくお願いします。残念ながら私の日本語は不十分ですから、これから I will be speaking in English from now on, and I'm grateful to our translators for making sense of what I'm going to say. I would like to begin by saying that in my mind, there is absolutely no question that the sacred island of Okinoshima and the associated sites of the Munakata region have outstanding universal value. And in my talk this afternoon, I would like to set Okinoshima in a global context for you. Before I begin my paper, I just want to make a couple of introductory comments. For the last 4 years, I have been involved in another research project about Kofun period archaeology. And this project is investigating a wonderful collection of Kofun period archaeological material in the British Museum in London. We have a collection assembled by a foreign specialist who lived in Japan in the late 19th century, a man called William Gowland. We have several hundred pieces of Sue pottery. We have bronze mirrors, we have armor, iron swords, horse trappings, many materials which are familiar from what we have seen today. Amongst those mirrors, and separate from the Gowland collection, is a very fine mirror. And 3 years ago, one of our colleagues from Kyushu University here in Fukuoka, Professor Tsujuta Junichiro, came and spent nearly a year with us in our research institute. And while he was with us, we visited the British Museum. He is a specialist on mirrors. We showed him this mirror, and he said, aha, maybe that is one of the mirrors from Okinoshima. So I like to think there is a direct connection between Okinoshima and the Japanese archaeology, the tiny amount of Japanese archaeology that we have in England. My second comment is I would like to offer my profound thanks, and maybe in front of our wonderful public audience today, I can offer these thanks on behalf of all of the foreign experts who have been so generously invited to Kyushu. And we've had this amazing privilege of being taken to Okinoshima. I'd like to thank everybody who has been involved in that. The World Heritage Promotion Committee of Fukuoka Prefecture, and particularly perhaps Professor Nishitani Tadashi, who maybe nearly 30 years ago very kindly showed a much younger English archaeology student around some of the key sites here in Kyushu when I really didn't speak any Japanese. Okay. What I'm going to do today is try and give you an introduction to Okinoshima and ask the question, how can somebody who will never be allowed to go to Okinoshima, a non-visitor, most people, how can they appreciate the value, that outstanding universal value of Okinoshima? When I first came, when I went to Okinoshima for the first time, in my head, I was constantly thinking, how do you explain such a complicated, wonderful, important site, which sits at the heart of early Japanese and early East Asian history, to people who maybe will come and spend 1 or 2 hours in the area, visiting a museum, looking from the Yohaijo across the straits out to the island, people with no idea about archaeology, about history. How can we explain to humanity in general the significance of this site? I have some suggestions. We have to weave some narratives. The Munakata deities are the deities of weaving, so maybe they can help us create these stories. We need to understand Okinoshima in East Asian history, in terms of religion, politics, and the interactions that are so important at that time. We need to think about an archaeology of religious experience, and I will talk about that more in a second. And we need to understand the change from worshipping in natural places to worshipping at monuments. That's a very important shift. And then I have some conclusions, and I'm going to talk about isolation and taboo, and the importance of secret places and hidden treasures. And in the course of the next 50 minutes, we will travel a long, long way from Okinoshima. We will take ourselves on a world tour of comparable sites. And I have a few slides to help you on that journey. Now, when I was an undergraduate student, many archaeologists felt that archaeology, the study of the material traces of the past, could not contribute to our understanding of religion. Moreover, many felt that religion was not an important part of understanding the development of human society and human behavior. In terms of understanding the causes of human development, religion was considered secondary to, for example, technology, economy, and politics. Ideology was important, religion less so. And yet, when I was an undergraduate, a long time ago, many people professed a religious belief, including many archaeologists. And many, in my background, went to church every Sunday. At the same time, and this is true, I think, when I first came to Japan 30 years ago, archaeologists I met were very cautious about using the historical records, including the Nihon Shoki and the Kojiki, to interpret the Japanese past. Following the difficult association between Shinto and militarism before and during the Second World War, these quasi-historical accounts were no longer taught in Japanese schools. Instead, archaeologists focused on interpreting just the material remains they dug up. But over the last 25 years, there's been a very major change. There is now a new field, the archaeology of religion. Many new books. Here are a few. Religion is no longer seen as epiphenomenal. In a world in which we have rising levels of fundamentalist religious belief, religion is now recognized as a major motivating factor in the past as well as in the present. And yet, curiously, in my own cultural context, less people profess a religious belief than ever before. In my own city of Norwich, in England, home to the highest density of medieval churches north of the Alps, and with two magnificent cathedrals, the most recent census, in which people are asked about their religious beliefs, suggested that Norwich is the most godless city in England, with the smallest population of people attending church every Sunday. But in Japan, I notice the opposite. People are talking endlessly about power spots. Many more people are visiting shrines and temples than they did perhaps 25 years ago. Two years ago, I had the tremendous privilege to visit the sacred island of Okinoshima. I received some very important advice and instruction before we went. This is an island of taboos. I was not to speak to anyone of what I saw, but I could show them pictures. I was not allowed to take anything away. That's a very important principle of visiting any archaeological site. I would have to purify myself through misogi, or bathing in the sea. Going to Okinoshima was an act of pilgrimage. We were going to a very remote place, and the crossing was likely to be very rough. I needed strong seasickness medicine. We were very lucky. The Munakata deities smiled on us that day, and we had a beautiful, smooth crossing. I believe it was very different 2 days ago. But there is no question that just going to Okinoshima was a clear rite of passage, a ritual that forms an important part of most religious beliefs. As somebody who does not practice any particular religion at home, I was still moved by a sense of awe, by the very special nature of the island, and by the sense of privileged access to what is clearly a very special part of the Japanese archipelago, removed from the everyday, with some very special environmental conditions. I was very aware that the vast majority of people, including my wife, along with all women, would never be allowed to visit this island. So while visiting, and since, I've been thinking about how can a flavour of the importance of this religious experience be passed on to ordinary people, to the people who cannot access Okinoshima. In this, I was guided by many of the archaeologists who are now working on the archaeology of religion. They are developing new ideas about how we can engage with material culture that is created and used as a result of religious motivation. Now, we are talking about UNESCO World Heritage Sites. And there are many UNESCO World Heritage Sites which cite religion in justification for inscription all around the world. They include the great cathedrals of Europe, the ceremonial urban centers of South and Central America, towns which have major ceremonial facilities. I'm thinking of the Temple of Heaven and the Imperial Sacrificial Altar in Beijing. But these monumental ceremonial centers and great cathedrals do not compare well with Okinoshima and its associated sites. Another category are centers of pilgrimage. Roman sites like Baalbek, the Muslim pilgrimage center focused near the city of Osh in Kyrgyzstan, the most complete example of a sacred mountain in Central Asia. Closer to home for me, the Christian centers of Santiago del Compostela in Spain, and closer to home in Japan, we have the sites of the Kii Peninsula, Kumano, and the great Buddhist center of Mount Koya. There's a further category of UNESCO World Heritage Sites with religious significance, which are deliberately set apart, isolated from the world of the everyday, and we will have a look at some of these in a few minutes, including Mount Athos in Greece and Skellig Michael in Ireland. There are sacred mountains which have been designated. You're all aware of Mount Fuji, which was inscribed just this year. And there are many other mountains around the world. And a final group of sites, which we will have a look at, are sacred groves, apparently natural openings in forests. And there are some examples in Africa which I want to draw your attention to. Now, back to those stories we have to tell good stories about our archaeology. And that's difficult. Over 80,000 artifacts have been excavated from the ritual sites on Okinoshima, including objects that we think we know the function of: mirrors, weapons, horse trappings, etc. And some for which the word function is more difficult to apply, such as these evocative stone miniatures. We can create stories around each of these objects and the places they were found. And indeed, over the last 2 days, we have heard an overwhelming richness of stories, of narratives from the 27 specialists who have been reinvestigating Okinoshima. Now, the middle centuries of the first millennium AD witnessed the development of a new East Asian consciousness. While there had been many contacts and influences throughout prehistory from the first peopling of the region over 1 million years ago, it was only with the spread of a literate Sinophone culture that we have evidence for self-aware engagement between the various polities that occupy the region now comprising China, Korea, and Japan. While older narratives talk of the rise of East Asian civilization and focus on cores and peripheries, usually with China at the core and the other polities on the peripheries, more recent scholarship emphasizes the multiplicity of contingent relationships that existed between the empires, states, and kingdoms that flourished and disappeared between the fall of the Han and the fall of the Tang dynasties, between the 3rd and the early 10th centuries. And one of our renowned scholars based in America, Wang Jianping, in his survey of recorded Chinese relations with Japan, ambassadors from the islands of the immortals, he talks in terms of the multipolar nature of the international system in Japan during this period. Within Japan itself, we have a series of shifts from autonomous but competing regional powers to a bureaucratic central state authority, with those in power self-consciously manipulating both the creation of history and structures of belief, including the worship of Buddha and the propagation of deities who were later to become the Shinto kami. These are shifts embodied in the commissioning of the first indigenous histories of the Yamato state, the Kojiki, the Nihon Shoki, and the written codification of ritual, the Engi Shiki. We have the construction of monumental buildings for the purpose of worship, exemplified by the Ise Grand Shrine, rebuilt this year, and the great Todaiji Temple. And all of this was undertaken in the context of the maintenance and regular redefinition of relationships with powers on the East Asian mainland, relationships that did so much to help define how Japanese rulers saw themselves. And the nature of these relationships were symbolically expressed and protected by the observances regularly undertaken at Okinoshima. The Chinese, in their imagination, think of a place called Fusang. And Fusang, which is based on the word for the mulberry tree, is a metaphor for ancient Japan. And this is what this quote is all about. I think we can think about that perception of Japan by the Chinese as we are weaving the narratives about Okinoshima for all of these visitors. And of course, we're helped in this by very evocative objects, such as the miniature loom that was discovered on the island during the excavations. Now, the main narratives that have been created around Okinoshima relate to the development of religious beliefs and practices in a regional context. And the importance of the archaeology of Okinoshima encourages us to think about the importance of the interactions between the various countries and empires that rose and fell during these centuries, when this East Asian consciousness first develops. And this East Asian consciousness is very important today. East Asia has the highest population densities in the world, the largest economies, and arguably the greatest cultural impact in the 21st century in terms of popular culture, fashion, and cuisine, and many other areas. And if Okinoshima can help us understand and appreciate the development of that East Asian consciousness in a global setting, then it truly has outstanding universal value. Now, as we've heard earlier today, the narratives of Okinoshima are usually divided into 5 distinct phases. Well, I'm not going to go through these in any detail, but I have 5 slides. And what I'd like you to do is put yourself in the minds of the people in each of those 5 phases. And how would they have perceived Okinoshima? Starting with somebody who may have been a Kyushu resident, or may have been a resident of the Kinai, who knows, Queen Himiko, who is alive at a time when Buddhism is starting to spread through China. In our second phase, we need to be thinking about the great king Yuryaku, who was starting to expand the Yamato polity out across the archipelago, beginning to gather together the treasures that up until that point had belonged to the regional chiefs in centers such as the Isonokami Shrine, and we heard about that this morning. In the second phase of rituals at Okinoshima, in China, work commences on a series of major Buddhist monuments, great cave temples, for example at Yungang. In the same phase, the great king Keitai begins to consolidate Yamato power over the regions, employing a strategy of royal sanctioned rituals to take control of agriculture, irrigation, and iron production. Rites and rituals that were previously the preserve of regional chiefs were taken over and made part of the royal preserve by palace ritualists. Diplomacy and succession were ritualized as part of this extension of royal control. And by the end of this phase, this person, Shotoku Taishi, is responsible for the introduction of a Chinese bureaucratic government and its institutions into Japan and the construction of some of the first of the major Buddhist monuments that we have here. And the phase ends with Japan withdrawing from the Korean peninsula following the defeat of the Hakusonko River at the hands of the Tang armies. In phase 3, we see the rulers of Tang China making use of both Buddhism and Taoism to keep their newly reunified empire in a state of contented subordination. In 666 AD, for the first time in 600 years, the Chinese empress performs Taoist rituals on the sacred mountain, expressing the unity of the Chinese empire. She embodies the harmony of the universe, and she at the same time is promoting the worship of Buddha and is acclaimed as a reincarnation of the Maitreya Buddha herself. It's a very cosmopolitan empire over which she rules. The Buddhist pilgrim Yi Jing travels across East Asia over a 24-year period. He leaves on a Persian ship and he goes to Sumatra and to Bengal. This is a globalized world. Huge monuments are commissioned. And we even have Manichaeism, a religion coming from Central Asia, from Iran, being supported in China. None of this is lost on the new Japanese ruler, Tenmu, who further enhances the use of ritual authority and establishes an administrative bureaucratic state with the emperor at the top, the rule of whose line is legitimated by the newly commissioned histories in which we find those first references to the Munakata deities. And at the same time, Tenmu's attention is focused on Ise, not so much on what's happening in Kyushu. With Tenmu, the process of state formation in Japan is completed in readiness for the establishment of the first Chinese-style capital at Nara and the construction of a series of monumental Buddhist temples epitomized by the Todaiji, founded in 738. The fourth phase of rituals at Okinoshima coincide with the later part of the Tang Empire and further new religious influences entering China, including some traces of Christianity. The great Buddhist monk Kukai, I hope I've got the kanji right for his name, who was to found the Shingon sect upon his return to Japan, travels in China between 804 and 806 AD. And he would have experienced that cosmopolitan atmosphere. But the golden age of the promotion of Buddhism in China was drawing to a close. And under one of the emperors, the Buddhist monasteries are suppressed on a massive scale. In England, we're used to Henry VIII and the Reformation. But in China, they're doing this 800 years earlier. Over 4,500 monasteries are demolished or turned into public buildings. 250,000 Buddhist monks and nuns were secularized and forced to pay tax. The Iranian religions were outlawed, as was Christianity. But at the same time, we have bustling port towns on the south coast of China, like Canton, known as Canfu. And we have written accounts by Arabian traders describing this multicultural entrepot of some 200,000 souls, where Chinese and Arabs rubbed shoulders with Japanese, Iranians, Malays, Brahmins, Chams, Khmers, and Sumatrans. So that history of Okinoshima, those 5 phases, needs to be understood in this very dynamic historical background of what's happening in East Asia. Now, I would like to turn to 6 themes which I think can help us structure our presentation of the archaeology of Okinoshima to a general visiting public. And these themes relate to the criteria which are being used to propose Okinoshima as a World Heritage Site. The first is the significance of votive offerings and structured depositions. The main rituals that took place on the island were offerings to the deities, probably to try and ensure safe crossings across the Genkai Sea. These rituals involved placing significant pieces of material culture in particular locations on the island, and this morning we heard from Professor Oda about this. The types of locations selected, on the rock, in the shade of the rock, in the open, varies through time. But it's always deliberate deposition. Now, we call this structured deposition, and it's something that we find in a number of different parts of the world. Here's an example of a Bronze Age settlement in Portugal, where a number of animal bones, perhaps following sacrifice, have been carefully placed in particular locations on the site. In England, in the Iron Age, a site called Danebury, many thousands of pits were excavated, and many of those pits contained carefully placed deposits. At Flag Fen, about 800 BC, people were throwing metal items, high-value metal items, into the water near their man-made special island. Offerings to the water gods, perhaps. In China, one of the most spectacular discoveries of recent years is at Sanxuande, in the southwest of China, where we have huge quantities of gilt, bronze, and animal bones placed in large sacrificial pits. At Okinoshima, the state of preservation of those structured deposits is excellent. And that is one of the reasons it is of such significance. A second theme relates to the role that religion plays in state formation. And we will hear more about this after my talk from Werner Steinhaus. All I want to do is show you a couple of pictures from just down the road, a place called Dazaifu, which for me is a very clear statement of what happens when religion is employed by the state for taking control of regions and for taking control of interactions with buildings, with writing, and with bureaucratization. My third theme is about religion and international interaction. And there is no question that the materials from Okinoshima are exemplary in this regard, because many of the items come from overseas. There was an exhibition a few years ago, I think it was in the Idemitsu Museum, about Okinoshima, and it was titled The Shosoin of the Sea. Now, the interactions between the developing polities in the Japanese archipelago, the Korean peninsula, and China brought Japan into contact with that very cosmopolitan network that I talked about earlier. It was a network that extended from Nara to Rome. And we know it as the Silk Roads. Okinoshima was part of one of the most extensive trade and exchange networks of the ancient world. We know that people in 8th century Japan had a concept of foreigners. They're depicted in this beautiful mother-of-pearl lid from a piece from the Shosoin. Now, I don't need to tell any of you of the importance of the Shosoin. If you look it up on Wikipedia, it rather surprisingly says that not many foreigners know about the Shosoin. It's a bit of a hidden treasure. But look what it contains. There it is. Fabulous musical instruments. Somebody's slippers. Maps of the world. Paper. Dinosaur teeth, maybe for medicinal purposes. Exotic plants, also for medicinal purposes. Now, why am I showing you these things? Maybe you know all about them. Imagine if these objects had been left outside at Okinoshima, there would be no trace left. All we have on Okinoshima are the durable materials, the pottery, the metals. Who knows what else was deposited there? We can perhaps compare the silk routes with the maritime networks of the Vikings in Europe. This trade network included relationships throughout the known world, into Europe, engaging with the Holy Roman Emperor Charlemagne, and across into Central Asia and probably beyond, to North Africa and as far as America. And it would be very interesting to do further work comparing Scandinavian Viking sites with what we have at Okinoshima. And we have sites which would lend themselves to comparison like that. The site of Jelling in Denmark, itself a World Heritage Site, where we have Viking burial mounds, rune stones with writing on them, and evidence for religious change from a pagan religion, the pagan Viking religion, to Christianity, with a church built just between the burial mounds. We have other sites which would be interesting to compare. Sutton Hoo in the east of England. And I'm very sorry that not all of these images are in your packs. I snuck a few extra examples in last night. Sutton Hoo is famous for its ship burial. A king of the Saxon period, of the 7th century, was buried in his ship beneath a great burial mound, a site that was discovered in 1939, full of wonderful treasures, many of which come from Europe and further afield. It would be interesting to look at the Kingdom of Redguard and compare it to the Monokata region here in Kyushu. My fourth theme is about worship in natural places. And now we're going to move to Western Africa and to the north of Scandinavia. In Nigeria, there are sacred groves of Osun Osogbo. And these are groves in the middle of forests where ritual practices take place. Some of them have monumental features. Many of them are just natural groves, but they have sacred significance. Timothy Insole, an archaeologist at Manchester University, has been excavating some of these groves. When he first went there, there was nothing on the ground. But excavating them, he discovered many broken pots and many animal bones and other items, which made me think there's a possible comparison with what we have at Okinoshima. Let's move north to another World Heritage Site, the sacred sites of the Sami peoples of northern Scandinavia. Nomadic peoples who depend on reindeer herding for their subsistence. And they worship at natural large rocks, which, when excavated, again produce evidence for ritual activity. And they have sacred islands. This is Ukonsaari in Finland. That's one of the most famous. Cold enough in winter for the lake around the island to freeze. And then we have another example of worship in natural places, the classical Greek sanctuaries of 2,000 to 3,000 years ago. Very often caves, such as the Psychro cave here, is the focus of votive offerings and ritual activity. The earliest Greek sanctuaries were not immediately recognizable as such. Unlike later sanctuaries, marked by physical structures like temples or even altars, many of these sacred places may not be visible in the archaeological record or even appear aesthetically very stunning. James Whitley, an old colleague of mine, an authority on the archaeology of ancient Greece, describes many as liminal places on the threshold of transition, both physical and spiritual. Mountaintops, springs, and caves all serve as examples of these types of early sacred locales. Some sanctuaries were specific to a specific god or rite of passage, but not necessarily so. Now let's move from natural places to monuments. And this is something that we see if we regard the Munakata Grand Shrine as a monument, and indeed the smaller shrines on Oshima and Okinoshima as monuments as well. And there's a lot of work happening in Europe and elsewhere on the nature of shrines from later prehistory through to the Roman period. And this transition from natural places to built places for worship is, I think, a rich topic for further comparison. Now, my final theme is about isolation and pilgrimage, and it brings us to sacred islands and to sacred mountains. And we're going to travel from the Pacific to Australia to the Himalayas to see some examples. Oh, and to, close to home for me, to England. Lindisfarne, Holy Island, I feel is particularly interesting in comparison to Okinoshima, because, like Okinoshima and the North Kyushu coast, it was subject to pirate raids. In the 9th century in Japan, it was pirates. In the 9th century in England, it was Vikings that were attacking these sites. They were locations which had been particularly chosen for their isolation. St. Columba, one of the people responsible for the introduction of Christianity to the British Isles, chose Iona, a very remote island off the west Scottish coast, for his monastic community, which produced amazing artworks, such as the Book of Kells. Off the west coast of Ireland, we have Skellig Michael, home to a community of Christian monks from the 7th century onwards, living in these stone cells, these very simple cells, but in a marine environment that reminded me of Okinoshima. We have other locations closer to the coast, but still remote and isolated. St. Michael's Mount in Cornwall, possibly referred to by the classical Roman author Pliny the Elder, who talks about the tin mines in the south of England. Perhaps a particularly relevant example is in Greece, Mount Athos. Again, home to many communities of Christian monks, Orthodox Christians, since the 11th century. Perhaps of significance for Okinoshima, because women are not allowed to visit Mount Athos, despite its World Heritage designation. In the Pacific, we have Papa Hanu Amokuku Akea. Apologies for my pronunciation. It works very well in katakana, which is a set of islands in the middle of the Pacific where there are remains of settlement and some ritual facilities. And perhaps most famously in the Pacific, that icon of isolated religious development at Rapa Nui, famous for its moai statues. Sacred islands, each unique and different, and we need to consider carefully how well they compare with Okinoshima. And if we go up, we find a different form of isolation in the high mountain peaks of the Himalayas, where pilgrims go to bathe at a height of over 5,500 meters. In the Andes in South America, we have mountain worship, including burial, resulting in these extraordinary mummified Incas. In Argentina, the highest archaeological site is over 8,000 meters, higher than Mount Fuji. And many sites, many peaks in the Andes are still worshipped to this day. Another very iconic mountain in the Uluru-Kata Juta National Park, Mount Uluru, sacred mountain of the Australian Aborigines, and a focus of rock art, and now forbidden to anybody else to go climbing on it. And closer to home, we have sacred mountains at Mount Miwa, Mount Koya, and of course, most recently, at Mount Fuji. So just to conclude, we've traveled the world, we've looked at comparable examples of sacred sites, islands, mountains, ritual deposits, shrines. Many of these sites are very well known and attract very large numbers of visitors. For me, the outstanding universal value of Okinoshima relates very much to the taboos that we started with and to that sense of isolation, its removal from everyday life. The city I live in Norwich, is very proud of its historic heritage and very worried that too many people might want to come and visit it and change its nature. At the moment, we are building a new expressway from London to Norwich. And many people living in the city are against that because they don't want to have lots of new visitors coming. But managed in the right way, it is possible to retain the essential character of places like Norwich. I think we have a challenge with Okinoshima, whose outstanding universal value is of a sacred but secret place, full of hidden treasures. And we must think very carefully about how we can best preserve and protect this unique and fragile resource. Thank you very much.
ケイナー様、ありがとうございました。